Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What I wanted to do to start was just to bring to your attention that whilst Metro and Light Rail in the UK quite rightly usually focuses on TfL and London Underground, Overground, DLR and Croydon, and obviously the historic reference to Farringdon earlier, there are other light rails and metros in the UK. The second system, as I like to call it, started operation in 1980 as Tyne and Wear Metro, using in part some of the oldest dedicated commuter railways in the world, dating back to 1839. The system remains in public ownership and control through Nexus. That's the Tyne and Wear Passenger Transport Executive. Nexus is our trading identity. And in some respects is a microcosm of the London situation, with a significant need for investment and reinvigoration. But of course, without the vibrancy of the London economy, without the boost of the Olympics, and with a much lower and static population base, therefore a more difficult proposition to make the business case to government. But where is it? Northeast of England, population of a little over 1 million, and famous for many things. Actually, the birthplace of the railways, George and Robert Stephenson, had their first workshops on the banks of the Tyne. Dorman Long actually built the Tyne Bridge, which was the forerunner, you'll recognise the design, to Sydney Harbour Bridge. Anthony Gormley, the famous sculptor, actually created the Angel of the North. Interesting photograph there. That's one of our metro cars going down to Doncaster for its three-quarter life refurbishment. You have to ask yourself why it doesn't go by rail, but it's actually on the A1. And of course, there's the internationally renowned Newcastle Brown Ale, first of course produced in Newcastle, not surprisingly. Well, let's get back to transport. Let's get back to the metro system. That's the metro as it currently operates. The core system opened in stages in the early 80s and has subsequently been extended twice, firstly up to the airport and secondly down to Sunderland. Both of those extensions are interesting, but perhaps focus on the second one to Sunderland. That's the only section of track in the UK where we have heavy rail and metro on the same track. Managed by Network Rail. We are looking nationally at a tram train initiative. That's one place where it currently works. So in many respects, Tyne and Wear Metro was unique. As I said, it was built between 1980 and 1985, and it was actually built as the core of a fully integrated regulated system, very much on the German model. Buses integrated fully into the system, and we used a lot of closed, largely unmanned stations. Again, the discussion this morning was very interesting about the customer focus that is now very much to the heart of metro operation and delivery. Go back to the 80s, then it was partly about engineering driven and also about the efficiency that you can achieve by taking staff off stations. The system was vertically integrated, a single organisation, i.e. Nexus, managed both the infrastructure and the operation, but it did introduce a number of light rail technologies, particularly around ticketing, information, and the station locations and spacing. But one of the quirks of UK is that a new piece of legislation came along in 1986, which actually privatised and deregulated the bus network. So having spent 5 years creating an integrated, fully integrated transport system in Tyne and Wear, the buses were deregulated in 1986, and that clearly had a massive impact on the ticketing systems and provided metro bus competition on some of the key corridors into the cities. One or two interesting photos about the system when it opened in the 80s. One of the custom-built interchanges, you can tell the age of this photograph, particularly by the buses. Some of them looked very elderly. Other things on there, the Metro livery. Okay, functional, but I would say uninspiring in the way in which we're presenting a modern transport image to potential passengers. As I say, a closed system, magnetic gates, unmanned, with the way in which the system was managed. I like this one here, how health and safety has moved over the last 30 years. Got quite a few shots of some of the construction work, and certainly my health and safety manager has a heart attack every time he sees them. And the last one on the left is really to show the scale of the construction that went on. That's in the centre of Newcastle, adjacent to the station. So it has a massive impact on the road network and the infrastructure, certainly in the central core. Moving on then, by 2004, 2005, we'd extended the system twice. We now had 60 stations on the system. Passenger growth was continuing up to 38 million, got up to 40 million journeys a year. And the system was making a massive contribution to the economy and the vibrancy of the area, partly by removing cars off the road, partly by giving accessibility to our city centres. And we were able to demonstrate to government, and this was very vitally important going forward, that the system was worth £8 for every £1 actually invested in it. But there was underlying problems as we got to 2004, 2005. Let's remember, the system was 25 years old. We were using some Victorian infrastructure, some viaducts, some embankments. Some of the track beds were Victorian, more than 100 years old. And these problems started to come to roost, where we had a lack of long-term funding commitment from government. We did an annual negotiation with government to get funding for the system. There was inadequate funding to actually reinvest and renew and upgrade the system. And 25 years on, your lifts, your escalators, your core systems are becoming life expired. And of course, the impact of that, the speed restrictions, the quality in what you're providing fails then to meet passenger expectations. What you're delivering in 2005 with the same infrastructure you had in 1980 doesn't compare well with the improvements that you see with the car over that same period. Just a few slides, some of the problems, some of the infrastructure problems we had, broken rails, cantilever collapse, escalator collapse, all demonstrating that by 2005, massive investment in the system was needed. And as I say, customer expectation, same product 25 years later, clearly not as attractive to the improvements that the motorcar industry made over the same time. Where technology moved on from 1980, when the most technologically adept piece of kit was a locking petrol cap, through to 2010, where you're seeing sat-nav, Bluetooth, aircon. The competition's moved on. We needed to move on with Metro. So, the solution. Solution we called Metro Reinvigoration, a three-phase proposition that we put to government in 2007. And I'm very pleased to say that government responded positively to this proposition, and we're now developing and implementing certainly the first two phases of that programme. In 2007, we got support for phase one, and in 2010, 2 weeks before the general election, and I'll come back to that later, we got support for phase two. That support for phase two was vitally important because phase two is the bit that looks at the core infrastructure of the metro system, looks at the track condition, looks at asset audit condition, looks at all the infrastructure. But we got support for that in 2010, subject to a 10% local contribution. I don't think I'll do that deal again. Through demonstrating to government value for money, through an operating concession, and I'll touch on that later, and that we were proactively managing the asset that we were responsible for. I'll touch then on the Metro operating concession. We needed to demonstrate to government that we were spending government's money wisely. And to do that, we needed to develop and go to the market with an operating concession. For those of you who've gone through that process in the UK environment, you'll appreciate that it does take some time and is governed by the EU Utilities Directive. We did agree with DfT very early on in the process that there would be an in-house bid, and we had 13 bidders initially from across the world. We got down to the last two, which were DB Regio, Tyne & Wear Limited, and the in-house bid. When we evaluated the last two, then the best bid on the table was from DB Regio, and they've actually operated the concession since 2010. What's the concessionaire responsible for? Well, fundamentally, it's responsible for delivering the metro service to Nexus prescribed standards, i.e. Nexus determines the timetable, the fare scale, the quality standards that we're looking for, and DB deliver that. They're also responsible for putting the fleet out and for the operational management of the system itself. But through the process of discussion with government, the asset itself, the infrastructure, remains within Nexus's control. But we needed to change our processes so that we could move from a project management to a program management based on clear, developed asset condition audits so that we could prioritize our programs and minimize the risk for future disruption to the system. We do that through a branch of Nexus called Nexus Rail, not very imaginative, you'll see, but nevertheless, and that group of staff actually are responsible for managing all the infrastructure and managing the renewals of that of the infrastructure. For the heavy maintenance of the station facilities, escalators, lifts, comm systems, signalling, and so on and so forth, and the maintenance of ticket machines and gates. So we went through this process of demonstrating value for money, and as I say, we then achieved approval for both phase 1 and phase 2 of Reinvigoration. Say a little about them on the next two slides. Phase 1 was a £60 million investment funded partly by government and partly by the private sector commercial deal that we did. That's delivered two major station enhancements, one in the middle of Newcastle, that's Haymarket Station in Newcastle. This one is Sunderland Station. Very significant improvements to the infrastructure in those two central stations, and the introduction of modern ticket machines. I normally tell a tale about watching, keep an eye on the clock. Our ticket machines, before we put in the new system, were designed and installed in 1980, when the minimum fare on Metro was 8 old p. And basically, there were large buckets to collect lots of change. Now, as our passengers now want to pay with credit cards, smart cards, notes, then clearly it was very important to us that we modernise our retail capacity. And so putting in new ticket machines was very central to phase 1 of the Reinvigoration. And that programme will be complete this summer. Phase 2 goes further. It's a £385 million investment over 10 years, aimed at improving track condition, doing a 3/4 life refurbishment of our Metro cars, so ultimately they can reach that standard of 40 to 45 years in operating service, rebuilding and upgrade our station infrastructure, and looking at our bridges, embankments, and undertaking necessary repairs. Phase 3 takes us beyond 2020 and is about the long-term future of Metro, and I will finish with that in a few minutes. But those are the three phases of Metro. You should say, well, where are we now? What have we actually achieved? Phase 1, as I said before, was about 2 major station improvements, partly to improve the quality of the infrastructure, but also very significantly to improve the customer environment. And as I mentioned earlier, introducing ticket machines that will take smart and will take PayWave. So basically we are taking a leap in the technology that we'll be providing on Metro. Phase 2 is also ongoing. It started in 2010. It's involved major track renewals and upgrades, significant improvements to our non-central area stations to improve the environment and the quality of what we're producing. And as I say, the Metro cars have gone through a 3/4 life, which have included stripping them right down to their bare metal frames and replacing some of that where necessary, to the first one that went back in service with a very different livery, much brighter, much more attractive to our customer. So I really wanted to finish by saying a little bit about, well, where are we now? Well, we now started the process of planning for phase 3. And we're doing that because of the lead times that Metro development actually takes. But the areas in where we are planning is firstly about network development. Where are the areas where potentially we could extend Metro, where that demand actually exists? What are the opportunities to convert some of the relatively heavy technologies that we use on Metro to a lighter technology and take advantage of the lower maintenance costs that that attracts? And what is the scope for making better use of the heavy rail network in the northeast by taking forward that tram train technology? Central to the thinking clearly will be integration, and by that I mean 3 things. Integration with land use, which we talked about earlier, integration with other transport modes, reintegrating with the bus network, reintegrating with the taxi network, and integrating the experience of travel with other activity, in particular retailing. Why I'm here today, ladies and gentlemen, is because in order to fulfill that brief, I need to understand the market-leading technologies which you as practitioners are delivering in your cities. And it is vitally important for me that we take advantage of that going forward. But the big challenge for me will be the line at the bottom. I mentioned before the current investment plan is 90% government grant, 10% local contribution. I clearly need to find a different funding mechanism going forward. But finally, ladies and gentlemen, the prize for the work that we're currently delivering and that long-term vision is that the future of Tyne and Wear Metro will be secured and the benefits that the system delivers will be embedded in the urban regeneration of the area. Thank you very much.